Welcome everyone to What's Happening in Crypto, exploring all of the latest from the crypto world and beyond. Can moving to a cashless society end corruption? Well, the question of moving towards a cashless society is one that freaks a lot of people out. And we're going to cover some of the pros and cons, I guess, of moving towards a cashless society. But you have to grapple with the reality of corruption globally. It is a cancerous plague eating away at the heart of many of the world's nations, from the richest nations to the poorest nations. Some are more affected than others, without a doubt. But bribery and corruption is destroying the political process and is making it really difficult for things like, protecting our forests and protecting our oceans and all these different things. Corruption is at the heart of so much of this. If we had fully transparent money, could we move towards ending corruption? Now, I'm going to finish this up with actually talking about a specific use case that has come up in Brazil. But first, let's cover off some of the pros and cons of moving to a cashless society. Now, some of the pros: we, of course, will reduce bribery and corruption. That's one, because we'll have that nice transparency that the blockchain does offer. Now, you don't necessarily need blockchain for this. You could trust, banks and governments to run the cashless society, but I really don't like that alternative because banks and governments continually prove that you can't really trust them as much as people might like to think that they can trust them. So if we had trustless systems that were totally transparent that anybody could look in on, that would be a revolution in terms of what we offer in terms of our cashless society. And I think a lot of the fears of a cashless society actually come back to the idea that governments and banks are going to control it. We, of course, would have less regular crime. That's things like drugs and crime and terrorism. And ironically, they like to often come out and say, hey, but Bitcoin's all about drugs, crime, and terrorism. Well, it's actually quite the opposite. It's not very good for drugs, crime, and terrorism because it's so easy to trace where that money is going to and from, unlike with cash, of course. No cash management. Of course, it costs money to print all of these bills and coins and to take them out of circulation, for businesses to count them every day and to store them, and then to take them to banks and for banks to store them, and so on and so forth. So there is definitely a cost involved in all of that. The paper trail, though, that is absolutely amazing in terms of not only ending corruption, but taxes. Not a big fan of taxes, but hey, for some that may be a positive, I guess. But it may actually help end some of the financial crimes that we see going on, because one of the big things that happens is money laundering. And the big banks are totally complicit in money laundering. And again, if you could have a totally transparent system where you could look in and say, hey, we've got a paper trail of where that money came from, who gave it to you, etc., etc., it would make money laundering very, very difficult, if not near impossible to do. I mean, it's humans. We're always going to find a way to game the system. But this would go a massive step towards what is an incredibly opaque industry, the banking industry that is, and making it transparent. So that could be a positive step if we had blockchain-based cashless society moving forward. Obviously, international payments, big bonus there for anyone who wants to be sending money around the world. Cash is not a very useful thing. You can put some in an envelope and put it in the mail and hope that it gets to its destination. Or if your friend's taking a bus to the neighboring country, you can give them a stack of cash and say, hey, take that to my grandma. But that's not very efficient when it comes down to it. Now, a lot of people, though, are scared about the idea of a cashless society. There are a lot of possible disadvantages to having a cash-free world. One, of course, is privacy. We're going to have less privacy, right? Because when you have cash, you go out, you spend it, you give it to somebody. Nobody knows except you and the person you gave the cash to. That's pretty big. Now, we do have privacy coins and the future of privacy coins. Governments obviously can't stop them, but they might not have them be easily regulated, or obviously a national currency may not be a privacy coin. Wouldn't make a lot of sense. But privacy coins do offer this cash-like feature in terms of being able to give somebody money without anyone else knowing about it. Now, there are different issues when it comes to like proving provenance of funds. Well, hey, I got paid, $20,000 in Monero. Wait, who paid you? I don't know. Somebody on the other end of the internet. And so then there are some questions Around that, potentially, I love privacy coins. I think they're an amazing addition to the cryptocurrency space, but in terms of what regulators might think moving into a cashless society, there's some questions there. Obviously, hacking. Hacking is massive. Hackers have figured out that, hey, there's not a lot of money stored in banks anymore. It's all digital. It's all on the internet. Hacking people's passwords for their cryptocurrency wallets has been big, but also hacking data and stealing data, hacking databases, hacking banks, and, stealing the ones and zeros out of the bank. All of this stuff has been big and will continue to be big, and that will be a big challenge of a cashless society moving forward. Obviously, having a private key and all these things, that is a big improvement on what it has been before, but people still have to store those private keys securely, and as the massive amount of crypto hacking has proven, they're simply not doing that. Technology problems. If we have a cashless society, what happens when your wallet's not working, when the network's down, when the power is out? That's a problem. And there have been different implementations that are being worked on, like, having satellites in space that work off of, not the internet, basically. That could help get around this. What if your phone isn't charged up? Well, that's a problem too. And there's a lot of different solutions that we can find to come around these. And for every problem that we bring forward in terms of the fears of a cashless society, there are, on the other hand, solutions that can make those good. What about having, like, the Cardano Metaps card that just came out? You just tap your card, right? And it reads it that way, so that if your phone's dead, you can still pay. But if there's no internet and there's no electricity, well, it still might be problematic. But I'll tell you, for a lot of businesses nowadays, that's still going to be problematic. Imagine if the power goes out in a restaurant. I imagine the situation is going to be pretty similar to how it is in New Zealand and a lot of countries where people don't even have cash. I'd almost never carry cash with me. So if I go to a restaurant and the power's out in the whole city, that's a problem. It really is, because I'm not going to be able to pay in cash. Now, look, anyone who has a card machine, has one of those old kind of, card stamper things that they used back in the day. They're the manual backup feature for credit cards. But still, there is that reality, and this is something that we'll have to work on. But as we get different radio networks, for example, we have GoTenna. They have basically let you send a Bitcoin transaction from one location to the next, piggybacking until they find an internet connection, basically, and then that transaction is processed. Imagine if we had that kind of a network, but globally, this kind of radio mesh network, so that if all the power is down on all the east coast of the USA, well, that's okay, because you'll be able to piggyback over to Chicago or down to Miami, and the transactions will be processed there using the radio networks. That's all possible. All possible. Now, another interesting one, this will only help increase inequality. The poor and the unbanked of the world will have an even harder time in a cashless society. Very possible. Very possible. I mean, these people already have a hard time if they can't afford to go out and get a $20 super cheap, super basic smartphone. Yeah, it's going to be slightly problematic. Again, maybe the card solution comes in for those people. You might have a future where people just put their QR code up who are begging for money, and it goes into their just tap card, and that's where the money goes. So there are solutions. I'm sure there'll be all kinds of nonprofits who'll be out in the streets, giving people out these different tap cards, and sure, they're going to get stolen. Cash gets stolen too. Let's not act like it doesn't. One thing that's perhaps an interesting criticism of the cashless society, the banks are going to win big time. Now, if we have, of course, this happening not on a blockchain system, if it's all just the banks, then they're charging fees on every single transaction happening. Look, I think there's a huge percentage of the transactions currently happening on credit and debit cards. Cash transactions have been steadily falling over the years as people move more towards these card-based systems. And if we had 100% card-based systems, well, then they get to charge transaction fees on 100% of the transactions happening globally every single day. That is a lot of power going to the banks. But if we had this happening in decentralized systems, well, then the power goes to the miners. So again, there's always a trade-off somewhere. Maybe there's the old classic, yeah, but you're going to spend so much money because you don't feel that physical money going out of your hand. Yeah, maybe. I think people will get used to it. People who have never had cash, think about the future generations when the idea of exchanging pieces of paper seems like some kind of a historic relic that, in the same way that I look at writing checks. That's crazy. Who still writes? Okay, I know people still write checks. My dad writes checks. I love you, Dad. But seriously, people still write checks. And that is kind of nuts when you think about it, based on, credit cards and debit cards and all these things. Who writes checks anymore? Cash will at some point go the same way, in spite of all of the fears that we might have about it. Now, this brings us to our blockchain-related story of the day. So, the Brazilian National Social Development Bank will be launching a pilot in January 2019, launching the BNDES token. Now, this will run on the Ethereum blockchain and be backed 1-for-1 with the Brazilian real. This is really exciting for me because Brazil is super underrepresented when it comes to the crypto scene, and to see a stable coin being launched in Brazil, also very cool. But this isn't a traditional stable coin in the sense that it's just going to exist on cryptocurrency exchanges for hedging against, market volatility or any of that stuff. That's what a lot of stable coins have been used for traditionally, but actually this is something very different. Now, this is backed by consensus, and the initial scope of this project is really, really limited. They're only having a few $100s for the pilot program. They're giving out to the National Film Agency for their payments, just to see how it works, just to get their kind of their feet wet, so to speak, and to feel out what it's like to be using these blockchain-based systems. But Brazil is a country that has, of course, suffered from corruption, like so many countries. Major corruption scandals, in fact, have rocked most of the previous governments in the past few years. So to see a solution that would go towards helping alleviate these problems of extreme corruption, being able to track money from point A to point B to C, D, and E, that's pretty big. And a lot of these concerns that I mentioned do affect Brazil. There are plenty of people in Brazil who will have a hard time potentially accessing the tools to operate in a cashless society, in terms of they're going to need a card or they're going to need a phone or whatever it might be. But the solutions will be found. They always are. But I would really like to know what you think about this. Do you think that it's a good idea what this Brazilian bank is doing? Do you think that we can actually move towards a cashless society? Do you think it's inevitable? Do you think that it will be a good thing or a bad thing? I would love to know your opinions on this topic down below in the comments section. Thank you so much for taking your time to watch the video today. If you enjoyed the video, leave a thumbs up. If you are new around here, subscribe to the channel. You can also hit the notification bell to know when I put out a new video. Long live the blockchain, and peace out till next time.